One of the things I didn't realize with this book speaks to kind of a bigger topic, I think, which was it's been really interesting getting initial reactions now that some folks have got it in their hands. And one of the things that keeps coming up is like, oh, you're really talking about faith in the Black freedom struggle. And honestly, man, it was like, it's one of those things where it's like, you sit with it for so long that you don't even think about it anymore. But when somebody else picks it up, it's like it's big. It's news almost. It's remarkable to them in that, it is worthy of remarking about. So I was actually really pleased about that we are, people who read this book are rethinking what activism looks like now that there is a more explicit articulation about the role of the church, of the Black church, and of faith in the struggle.
So do you feel like people aren't really checking for Jesus anymore? Like not in the context of like a local church. So this is context. You were talking to me about this, and it's like, man, this is really fascinating to see people like doing faith things and like the church still moving. Because again, I'm in a little bit of a interesting space. I'm in a southern state. I'm in, what has often been called the buckle of the Bible Belt. Pensacola was, Guinness World Record holder for most churches in one city per capita in the entire world at one time. So
Mm.
literally three churches on every corner. So faith and faith expression is very common to me. It's very um, just normal to me, but also it's a lot of performative faith expression. So you'll have
Uh,
people, so you have all these churches, but 61% of the county is unchurched.
mm,
So you think about that. Most churches potentially per capita in the world in one city, and over 50% of people in the city, even at that time when it was years ago, probably 13 years ago, weren't going to church or weren't affiliated with a local church.
mm.
So it's like, what is really the purpose of all this? So I get all that, but it's like for me, I'm like, man, it seems like it's normal. You go to church on Sunday, like you're building, like you're encouraging people, you're in community, like those things are happening. But I'm finding that for a lot of people, that's not a normal occurrence.
That actually reminds me of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, just released a report called the 2023 PRRI Census of American Religion. It is county level data on religious identity and diversity. They surveyed 500,000 people and got a snapshot of the religious landscape. And what you say just matches up completely with their findings. So I'll just read one of the lines. Um, White evangelical Protestants have experienced the most significant drop in affiliation from 23% of the population in 2006 to 13% of the population in 2023. So from
A huge drop,
23% to 13%.
a huge
And
drop.
that coincides with the rise of the religiously unaffiliated, otherwise known as the nuns, NONES,
Right.
which there's been a significant increase from 21% in 2013 to 27% in 2023. So there's more than double the number of religiously unaffiliated as there are white evangelical Protestants now. Brought on by a host of reasons, of course. And then to our context, there's been a decline in the number of Black people who identify with a specific religion as well. So it's still high. More than 7 in 10 Black Americans, 72%, are
Mhm.
Christian. Um, but the rise of the people who don't identify with any religion in particular has also increased. Around
Right.
one quarter of Black Americans are religiously unaffiliated, 24%.
So, like, what do you? This is really fascinating. What do you feel about the church today and its relevance, especially in the context of the freedom struggle and context of justice, which we often talk about, but we're deeply rooted in the church, deeply invested in the church. People don't believe that, but we're deeply rooted and invested in the church.
Right.
So I see, man, testimony after testimony, story after story
Yeah.
of people leaving behind what has been moments of bondage, dysfunction, what a lot of us would call in our faith circles sin, or the patterns of sin, and walking in the light. And that's my joy. I get to see and witness
Yeah.
that every single week. But I realize that's not the case for everybody because of institutional religion, the big C church, the big box church, whatever it may be. But I see that all the time. And deeply flawed. Like, so I don't want you to think like, oh, our church got it clocked. We got it figured out. Like, we're in the hood. So like deep, we're in the hood, man. So it's just like, multi-ethnic church actually now out of random circumstance in the hood,
Mm,
black led, black centered, black
mm.
expressed, multi-ethnic church in the hood. So it's just like,
Sound like a kind of church I want to be at.
man, it's just
Um,
been very interesting. So when we talked, I was like, man, it's really fascinating to hear you make observations about what you see in the church and what you see even us talking about or posting.
well, I thought it was a big deal. You posted some pics on Instagram of some baptisms that were happening at your church, which I remember in high school, baptism was the thing. It was get them saved, say the
Right.
sinner's prayer, and then baptize them. And then it was like this big thing at church, right? And I was like, I saw your pics, and I just kind of sat back. I'm like, huh, that's still a thing.
Yeah.
because because I have so been in the context of like people deconstructing, decolonizing, leaving the institutionalized church, the rise of the religiously unaffiliated, right? And I'm like, yo, is the church delivering people still? Is that
Mm,
still a thing? You know what
mm,
I'm saying? So, or has it become somewhat of a faux pas? Like you're not supposed to be out there with your faith. Remember 116 unashamed,
unashamed,
like
homeboy.
is that still a thing, kind of a in terms of like go out and tell people about
Right.
Jesus? That's the cool thing, that's the thing that we do. And I'm just curious, like from your perspective, what is the landscape for like even something as central to the faith as baptism?
Yeah.
Seems like it could be fraught or
So
controversial.
I think that question is a really striking question. This whole idea of, is the church really delivering people anymore? Which I think the root underneath all of that, the question behind the question is, does the church have power still?
Ooh, come on.
And I think many times the power comes from the credibility of the church. So because of the lack of credibility, I think people can believe that the church has lost its power. I think in
Mm,
some cases that is
mm,
true, because I think that the church has traded power for porridge, right? Traded power for a pot of stew, right? And that cup has been the idea of not spiritual power, but political and social power and influence. And so rather than having true, lasting supernatural power, which can actually lead to the transformation of people, what has now happened is we traded that power for a pot of porridge. And that pot of porridge is satiating for now, but it's actually poisonous for later because we have no power to actually sustain what is true transformation and change. So let me give you another perspective of this, right? Another side of this is Carrie Newhoff actually recently just posted this whole concept of big box church and how
mm.
people now it's like, okay, there was a run from like 20, I think he said mid 2000s to 20, mid 2010s, where it was just like big box church was working because you just add water and stir, you just like, have all these tremendous programs and ideas. And if you set up the right formula, now church is working. But here's the issue with that. He said it's no longer working. Now, what he interpreted it as is that the culture has changed. What I interpreted it as is, yes, I believe the culture has changed, but what happened in the mid 2010s that now lost the church lost its power? Well, you had the Black freedom struggle. You had you had the election of 45. Like, so now I'm seeing, okay, so the church lost its power, or has it traded its power, and now it has no ability to transform, which is, if you're not speaking to justice, if you're not speaking to the lived flourishing of your neighbors, if you're not speaking to the rise of Christian nationalism, if you're not speaking these things, the world tunes you out. So is it that we've
Wow.
lost power, or is it actually that we've traded that power in for something that's an approximation of power? And now we're shocked that people aren't affiliating with us. Oh my goodness. And
Of
here's
course.
another thing. This is the final thing that I think is so fascinating too. The thing that is so fascinating is there is both polarities are skewing what the church actually is. So on one side, you have a polarity of people that are completely deconstructing out of the faith. That's their journey, and they're having to navigate deep pain and trauma. So I'm not here to poo-poo that journey, but it is leading to people to think that there are no churches,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So some people think there's like no churches at all, or no faith work happening. But then you have another polarity, and on the other side of things, you have mega churches.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's leading you to think that there's this wave of revival. It kind of depends. It's kind of a little bit of a Rorschach test of like where you're looking. But what I find though is there are far more now than what people know of small to medium sized
Mm.
faithful churches that are built around the return to the essence of what the faith has truly been, which is worship of our Savior, love of our neighbor, care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and a deep, abiding community that supports one another and creates safe spaces for us to advocate for one another. And I found that that is actually, people are reverting back to a desire for that versus big box mega church, or even the deconstruction out of the faith. I
Mm.
found that there's this kind of hanging, suspending group that is waiting for somebody to stand up and say there's a better way to have church, and there's a better way to represent your faith that doesn't cause you to leave all the things you care about at the door.
See, that's the new wrinkle I think you inserted is, aside from the scandal, there's a lot of scandals that have pushed people away from church, and they tend to concentrate, or I'll say this, mega churches tend to be especially prone to certain kinds of scandals, right? Um, so it's given like all churches a bad name. But what you added was, uh even with the deconstructing movement, there might be maybe the beginnings of a, if not a disillusionment, a consideration that I don't necessarily want to leave the faith, or I'm still looking for
Right.
some sort of spiritual community, and I don't want to sort of walk my way all the way out of it. I just want
Yeah.
something better.
And this is the thing, even with deconstruction, like I think that's a good process for all of us to go through. That's a
Right.
natural process for all of us to go through. I think the connections with the origins of the name and the word and all that type of stuff, and Deridia and all that, that y'all can parse through all that on your own. What I'm more talking about is a challenging of whether or not those preferences are actually spiritual rules and spiritual practices. That's a good thing to question and ask. But I think for a lot of people, they actually want to worship Jesus.
Mm,
And here's what I think. What I found is people are oddly comforted when they find out that Jesus still has power to save.
mm.
They're oddly comforted because they have been discipled and formed by a culture that says Jesus is ancillary or secondary, but he doesn't have to be primary. And when they find out that there's joy and there's peace and there's power and there's justice in Jesus, they are fascinated, comforted, and deeply in love with that idea. That's what I found.
That's what that's what stuck out to me in the pictures of the baptisms. It was like, these are folks getting baptized, and it's like a turning point in their lives for the better. They were ecstatic, they were joyful, they were all smiles. And I'm like, oh, snap, what is the journey now? In 2024, with all of the baggage that churches tend to have these days, even if it's just perception more than reality, I'm like, it feels remarkable to me that new believers are still finding their way to
Yeah.
Jesus and we're still doing baptisms and all of that.